in higher education and the humanities was exceptional. So this lectureship is awarded to an undergraduate student whose qualities of mind and spirit have been expressed eloquently on one or more of the basic concerns of the humanities: form, value, and memory. The award is presented by the Gaines Center for the Humanities, and the Edward T. Breathitt Lecturer receives a special award, and which we'll have to put in the mail to you, Emily, and an honorarium of $500. So for our 2021 Breathitt Lecture, the Gaines Center for the Humanity is pleased to welcome senior Lewis Honors College student and double major in interiors and modern classical languages, Emily Andreasson. Emily hails from Williamsburg, Michigan, and has been an active member of our campus community since she came to UK in 2017. She serves as the vice president of the Interior Design Student Association, a mentor in the French Club, and a co-founder of the Lewis Honors College Literature Club. She has been on the Dean's List every semester since 2017, and in the spring of 2020, she was awarded both the College of Design Research Award and the Rising Star Award for French and Francophone Studies. In 2018, Emily studied abroad in Paris, France, with Professors Georges Sauer and Jeffrey Peters, a transformative experience that inspired the project you will hear about tonight. We want to take a moment to express our gratitude to Emily's mentors, Dr. Lindsay Fay, Helen Turner, and Dr. Patrick Lewis from the College of Design, who helped this presentation come to fruition. We would also like to thank the Colleges of Arts and Sciences and the College of Design for their continued support of Emily and also the Gaines Center for the Humanities. I would be remiss if I did not thank the staff of the Gaines Center, our Associate Director, Chelsea Brislin, who handles all the logistics for choosing the Breathitt Lecture and making this event real, and our Administrative Assistant, Connie Duncan, for their work organizing this event and making sure the Gaines Center continues to uphold its mission, even in these challenging times. So before we hear from Emily, I'm going to ask that if you have any questions during the presentation, that you put those questions in the Q&A box along the bottom of the screen. And once the presentation is concluded, Emily, then I will come back and I will ask you the questions that are provided to us by our very able and interested audience. So without further delay, please welcome Emily Andreasson. I feel like we should get some canned applause at this point, but if we were in a room together, I'm sure the applause would be significant for your hard work.
Thank you. Well, I think it's less intimidating when there's no applause, so that's okay with me. All right. So I'm sharing my screen. Melinda, can you see that? And Chelsea?
We can.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chelsea, Melinda and Chelsea, for organizing all of this and for that incredible introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be here this evening. Thank you all for coming. As Melinda said, I will be presenting my senior interior design capstone project, which I'm currently working on. It is entitled Ellipsis, and it is a space that is seeking to create room for expression and healing amidst the liminal experience of displacement, and looking at the experience of asylum seekers and refugees, specifically in France. I'm going to start by walking you through a little bit of the research that has gone into this project, and then looking at the space as I'm working on it currently. So Melinda gave me an excellent introduction. Again, thank you. I typically introduce myself as an artist and a designer, but I also have a deep passion for different languages and cultures, hence my French major. And personally, I find that those languages and cultures And exploring different interests always inspires my creativity as an artist and a designer. And this project has been really exciting to me because it's been able to combine all three of those interests in art, design, and different languages and cultures in a really dynamic way that has been really fun for me to work on. So to begin with, I want to define ellipsis, the title of my project, and why I chose that as my title. You're all probably familiar with the punctuation symbol of an ellipses, but more specifically, an ellipsis is the omission of one or more words that are obviously understood, but that must be supplied to make a construction grammatically complete, and or a sudden leap from one topic to another. I chose this as the title of my project because it really beautifully encapsulates the experience of displacement and the experience of asylum seekers and refugees. These are groups of people that are often more convenient to ignore or forget about in our society and to not address the challenges that they're facing. And the experience of displacement in and of itself is very jarring. It's a leap from one culture into a linguistically and culturally foreign space. And so the idea of an ellipsis really looks at the challenge and the issues that my project seeks to address. A couple more terms that I think it's important to define before getting into my research because they come up a lot are refugee, asylum seeker, and displaced person. These terms are generally, I would say, familiar, but often poorly understood. Um, in fact, in a lot of my research, I found that these terms were being used incorrectly, interchangeably, and they actually describe quite distinct experiences. So, to begin with, a refugee is a person who has already achieved a certain status in their host country. A host country is the term I'm using to describe the country that a displaced person finds themselves in after displacement that they are seeking to remain in. So a refugee has left their country of origin, birth, nationality, and they've gained the status of refugee in their host country. And that means that they have a certain level of stability, certain rights, and certain privileges within that host country. An asylum seeker is a less understood term. You can think of it as sort of a pre refugee status. Asylum seekers have similarly been displaced. They are similarly in a host country and have left their country of origin, of birth, nationality. However, they have not yet received refugee status. That is what they are typically working towards. Um, and so they do not have the same stability, they do not have the same rights and the same privileges or the same access to resources that refugees typically have. And then a displaced person is a term that can be used to describe both a refugee and an asylum seeker, as well as other groups of people. It simply describes an individual who, for whatever reason, maybe violence, persecution, religious or political reasons, has been displaced from their country of origin and is residing in a host country. So the first issue that I looked at in my research was the way that these groups are presented in the media and the impact that that has on their experience. So typically the media creates very specific identities for refugees, and usually they create one of two identities. They either present refugees and asylum seekers as criminals, illegal outsiders who are coming into a country and creating problems, or they present them as this self-pitying victim, this vulnerable person who's very helpless in their own situation. And both of these perceptions are incredibly damaging, both to public perception and to self-perception, the way that asylum seekers and refugees view themselves. As you can imagine, if you're surrounded by voices and media that are telling you you are a criminal and you are problematic, you don't have a lot of initiative to change that perception, and you may in fact fulfill that, even though that is not your own identity and your own story and experience. And similarly, if you're being told that you have no agency, you're helpless, you're a victim of your own situation and your circumstances, you tend to fall into that role. And likewise, if you are a member of a community and your media and your government and news sources are telling you that these groups of people coming into your country are either problematic or they're victims, that will color and influence the way that you perceive them, the way that you interact with them, and the way that you treat them. And so overall, the way that the media presents asylum seekers and refugees tends to deepen the already existing linguistic and cultural barriers between people, and between refugees and asylum seekers and the communities in their host countries. Um, and it erases the identities and unique experiences of asylum seekers and refugees. In addition to media misrepresentation, asylum seekers also face a multitude of physical, tangible challenges. These include poverty, navigating bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is often set up to be difficult to navigate for asylum seekers in order to discourage them from remaining in a specific coast country, or prevent them from gaining refugee status. There's often a language barrier. Many individuals experience isolation. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. Detention policies and centers are also very difficult and sometimes traumatic to experience and navigate. And then, of course, racism and stigmatization is a significant challenge, which is exacerbated by the way the media presents asylum seekers and refugees. My project, as I mentioned, is specifically located in France because of my interest in that country and also because of the challenges that they have experienced since 2015 with asylum seekers and refugees coming into the country. And my project specifically is in Paris because Paris, in addition to the southeast border regions of France, is one of the most saturated parts of the country in terms of foreign-born populations. And when I say foreign-born, that includes immigrants and refugees and people who may be temporarily living in those areas, but it's also heavily influenced by the population of asylum seekers. Beyond physical challenges, many asylum seekers and refugees are unable to work or study or create or really do anything productive while they're in the process of obtaining documentation and becoming settled in their host country. For asylum seekers, this has to do with laws that are in place prior to gaining refugee status. You really are not able to do very much. And that's partly where isolation can become a major issue because people don't really have anywhere to go or anything to do. And so that isolation, inability to be productive, coupled with fighting against stereotypes in the way that the media presents individuals, in addition to physical challenges and potentially traumatic experiences that individuals may have in their host country. All of these things together place asylum seekers and refugees at a much higher risk of developing mental health challenges and has been shown to increase the risk of developing suicidal thoughts or attempting or completing suicide, which is both an individual tragedy and I would argue a larger social tragedy. And this is where art comes into my project. Art has been shown through numerous studies to stimulate healing across time and culture and to stimulate healing in relation to trauma. And one of the articles that I read for this actually suggested that art, it can be defined as objectifying a feeling so that it can be contemplated and understood without language. And it emphasized the fact that art exists outside of language, and therefore it has the capacity to subvert biases that are created by linguistics and to transcend barriers of culture and bring people together. And that brings me to the core goals of my project, Ellipsis. And these are to create a space that allows for expression, connection, and healing. Expression of the identity and unique experience of asylum seekers and refugees. So returning the voice and their story to them rather than allowing the media to define their experience and define the way that they are perceived. Stimulating connection, both providing connections for asylum seekers with other individuals with similar experiences, whether they also be asylum seekers or refugees with past similar experiences, but also connections between asylum seekers and the community in their host country, and starting to heal the schism that is created between those two with all of the challenges that I have just discussed. As I mentioned before, I chose Paris as the location of this project, and specifically my project is located in the 18th arrondissement of Paris, which is the north part. And in addition to Paris as a whole being quite densely populated with a foreign-born population, the northern arrondissement or departments are the most populated of the city as a whole. And in addition, the 18th arrondissement has several key features that made it a good place for my project to be located. The most important of these is the Porte de la Chapelle tent city, which is essentially a slum. It's located sort of under a highway or freeway overpass. So it's actually almost invisible to the city unless you're in a very specific place or in the midst of it, which again relates so strongly to the idea that it's easier to overlook or ignore the challenges and the experience of asylum seekers. And this tent city has been cleared out and come back numerous times, so it continues to be a challenge. And it indicates to me the density of asylum seekers in this area and the need for a community space for them. So the name of my project is Ellipsis, but the name of the space that I'm creating specifically and the structure is La Langue du Lien, which for the Anglophones in the audience is the language of connection, an arts and community center for asylum seekers and refugees. In design, we typically do a lot of research, and then we look at how some of that research can develop visually and start to be expressed visually and spatially. So what you're seeing here are some preliminary ways of exploring how concepts such as connection and overlap and interaction and engagement can translate into a physical space. And also because I've looked so much at the experience of being in sort of an in-between or a liminal space and a space of uncertainty in the experience of being an asylum seeker, I also wanted to engage what physical spaces and what spaces in interiors can be described as liminal spaces. And that can be primarily hallways, but anywhere that you consider sort of a pass-through space, a space that people don't really remain in. And so on the right there is a diagram that's looking at how those pass-through spaces can be engaged with the design. Programmatically, my space primarily concerns itself with creating space for studios, galleries, resources, and places of refuge. So this is a two-story structure. The first level is devoted more to gallery spaces and resources. So again, the ground level is on the left side of the screen here. And there is a static arts gallery, a performance gallery to accommodate different kinds of art and different kinds of expression. There are resource offices which can be inhabited both by administrative personnel who are helping to manage this space specifically, but also by individuals who may be representing other resources in Paris more largely. For example, there are certain organizations that can help asylum seekers and refugees to navigate bureaucracy or to overcome linguistic barriers. But those are sometimes hard to find. So this space provides the opportunity for asylum seekers and refugees to meet directly with people who can connect them with those opportunities. And the gallery spaces are also adjacent to lounge spaces, which are intended to facilitate the, the connection that I'm looking at creating in this space, and interaction between community members who may be coming in to view artwork and asylum seekers or users of the space who are spending time in the lounge, relaxing, finding refuge in those areas. On the right of the screen is the second level, or in France, we would call it the first level, le premier étage. And this level is primarily composed of studio spaces. Similar to the gallery spaces, I wanted to provide studios for a variety of different creative expressions. So there are studio spaces for painting and drawing, studios that are set up for dance, for 3D creation, for ceramics, for photography, for sound and video development, so that there really isn't a limit placed on what creative expression can be done in these spaces. This is a visualization of one of the gallery spaces on the first floor with a view up into one of the studios at the far end. I utilize sightlines quite heavily throughout this project to also create connections. So the idea is that individuals who are in the gallery space are sort of invited to have a curiosity and a visual engagement at the very least with the artists who are working in the studios, and to develop a sense of empathy and curiosity for the experience and who they are as individuals and what they are creating. This space is also an example of where I'm using an interior design theory called the mystery and complexity theory. And that theory is essentially that if you can see a little bit of a space and you can tell that there's more going on, you're drawn in to engage with it more and explore more and learn more about the space. And so similarly to sightlines, I am seeking to draw people into the space and then draw them in deeper to understanding the asylum seeker experience. I'm also capitalizing on some of the architecture that is already existing in Paris structures. A lot of Parisian buildings have these beautiful large door window features in facades where these windows are essentially, they can open up and become doorways into a space, but they also provide a lot of viewing from the street into interior spaces. And so again, with that, I'm trying to use the mystery and complexity theory to draw people in off of the street by the artwork shown in gallery spaces and by sort of being able to see into the studios a little bit. And then through that, they start to engage more deeply with the experience being expressed there. This is a visualization of one of the dance studios. The studios I have designed to be fairly minimalistic so that they allow the artist to create and the artist to fill that space, and so that the design does not stifle in any way the expression of the people working in that space and utilizing that space. But at the same time, the design is seeking to use architectural elements that are already there, lighting and views to create as beautiful and welcoming a space for creativity as possible. And this is a visualization of one of the second level or premier étage hallways and the engagement of liminal spaces that I had mentioned before. So in this hallway, I have created a series of recessed seating opportunities, and this provides areas of refuge and respite. But since they are in a hallway space or a pass-through space, it also provides the opportunity for chance encounters and connections to be created in that way. So someone sitting and reading or drawing or simply resting in one of these areas might see someone else passing through and strike up a conversation and create connections in that manner. Overall, the way that I've organized these spaces throughout are intended to facilitate those connections again. And you can kind of see the way that the different communities that these spaces are catering towards are kind of wrapping together and mingling together to create that overlap and that connection. Ultimately, I argue that we create space for what's important. You may have heard this in different contexts in terms of time and scheduling and creating space for what's important to you in your life. But architecture and interiors reflect what our culture values and wants to create space for. And so the lack of physical space for certain groups and activities reflects a larger metaphysical lack of space for those groups and activities in our social perspective and mindset. And in a world that is increasingly interconnected and continues to face challenges and issues of asylum seekers and human migration, we need to consider the way that we are responding to them with our physical spaces and what that is reflecting about our society's strengths and weaknesses. This project is one way of interrupting the ellipsis and bringing empathy and perspective to the refugee and asylum seeker experience and answering that question of how we can create physical space and metaphysical space for people who are easier to ignore or omit from our lives. And it looks at how we can use space to transcend barriers, linguistic, cultural, in terms of distance and time, to create connections and healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. We're going to ask all of you who are listening to this wonderful presentation if you would go ahead and begin putting your questions into the Q&A box. We already have one question from Taylor Barton. And the question is, how do you anticipate this design could impact the local region as well as on a global scale? This is very powerful and compelling.
Thank you, Taylor. That is a great question. My hope is that on a local level, this creates a stronger community and stronger connections between different groups and groups that might even view each other with a sense of animosity simply because they have misconceptions about who the individuals in the other group are. On a global level, I think that that goes back to what I said at the end about creating space and helping or allowing the space that we create to reflect the values that we have as a society and as a global world. So this space is one opportunity for instead of sort of falling into the example of the tent city at Porte de la Chapelle, where we are not creating space for a group of people, we are forgetting them. This space does create space for them and acknowledges them and actually provides the opportunity for them to express their experience. And I think that on a global level, that can be replicated in so many different ways.
I'm sorry, participants, if I don't get your names correct, but Dayala Samadi said that with COVID, social distancing has challenged the way we engage with each other. How does this influence the way we can use space to facilitate connection? And that she also added, or he or she added that it's a beautiful talk.
Thank you. That's a great question. And as designers, we've definitely been influenced in our thinking by COVID-19. I think one thing that's important to remember is that COVID-19 is not a forever situation, and we will be able to have physical connection in spaces again. But space itself can create a sense of connection in the way that it's designed and the values that it communicates. And so, in the case of this space specifically, you can think about the sightlines that are created and how that creates visual connection, even though there may not be physical proximity. And a lot of spaces can utilize that rather than sort of like placing someone in a space where they feel alone, you can visually make them feel connected to other people.
Thank you for that. So Patrick Lee Lucas asks, what next? What's next for this specific project this semester and after? And what's next for you as you make the transition to the professional world, which is also similar to the question that was asked by Alyssa Pohl. So if you could tell us what's next for you and what will you be pursuing further beyond design and in the ideas that you have now?
Absolutely. So with this project specifically, what's next is a continuation of developing the ideas that I've discussed in the research, and developing individual spaces further so that the research and the problems that I'm seeking to solve are addressed in each of the various spaces within the project. For me personally, I am currently planning to go to a master's program in fine arts in the UK, which is combining my interests in arts and in different cultures to continue to explore how I can use my creativity and my artistic talents to create connections with different people and different cultures, and also using my interest in research and learning to express that through visual media.
Um, Joe Ray Bello asks, how has this project shaped your views of the role of design and your role as designer in our lives and as a tool for shaping the human experience?
That's a great question, Joe. I think I have always been very aware of how impactful space is on our experience. And for me personally, physical space has always been like 40% of my experience of wherever I am, even if I'm having a positive experience, if the space I'm in is very negative, that has a significant impact on it. So I've always been aware of that. This project has really made me think about the space that we create for specific people and how that brings light to certain groups of people and casts others into shadow. And so I think that moving forward, that will be something I think about a lot more, even though, I would like to think I've always considered that. Thinking about like what user groups a space is set up for, and in that what user groups it's not set up for, and how there can be a greater inclusion developed through design or through redesign.
So this ties into exactly what you were saying about designing for a particular group of people. So Aditya Sriram asked if images of people and living objects are haram in Islam, and many refugees are devout Muslims. Do you think having resources for refugees amidst an art gallery will negatively affect them or culturally alienate them? And they also add amazing job.
Thank you. That's a great question. I don't think so because art is not necessarily figurative. And there are many ways of creating art and being expressive uh, without running into barriers like religious barriers or barriers in belief. And I think that part of this project is creating or facilitating a deeper understanding of different cultures. And so if there is something in a culture that you don't necessarily agree with or that is off-putting to you, simply ignoring it is not really a resolution. And having some ability to understand it further, in my opinion, is of more value, and develops a greater respect between cultures and a greater understanding, even if you continue to disagree.
Um, Thank you so much for that. So Monica Visona she said, thank you so much, Emily. This was wonderful. Did you have a chance to study any of the spaces that have similar aims in Paris, such as the Musée de l'Immigration, which displays art and has activities?
That's a great question. That specific one I did not look into, but there is an organization that I studied called the Atelier d'Artistes en Exil, which has a similar aim as well in terms of creating space for artistic expression. And one of the things that I found interesting in that space was their mission was very similar to the kind of space that I wanted to create. And it was actually finding an interior location and a building that they could actually present their work in that was a challenge. So it was really interesting to be able to look at and even read, like they had a lot of information about the artists that they were working with and their personal stories and where they came from. So as a designer, that helped me to develop a lot of empathy and understanding for the users that I am seeking to cater towards primarily. And then also look at what kind of space they really need. Sometimes as designers, we can get a little carried away with what we think a group needs, and we forget to actually ask what is necessary. So that was really helpful in my research and design development project process.
Mhm. Oh, my mic's on. I wanted to just add a quick question before I'm going to get to you in just a second, Zoe Hurt. But just to tag on to the question that Monica and Aditya have both asked, and you mentioned the use of a lot of like the windows and that very much mirror French design. But I have not spent much time in Paris, but I do remember like the ways in which the places we think of as very Parisian, like where tourists would go, as being very much in conflict with displaced persons who would sell souvenirs. And I wondered if you thought any about maybe to disrupt the Frenchness of the space in order to make it more welcome or inviting to those particular people, maybe drawing from the architecture of the places from which they may originate.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something that came into play in my selection of finishes and interior materials. The structure that I'm working with is an existing one, or this is a theoretical project, but it is a theoretically existing structure. So I do have to respect to some degree the architecture that's already there. But I did look at a lot of architecture and interiors during my research that were um, often for embassies. So for groups that are existing outside of their familiar culture, and how those spaces create a familiarity and a welcoming environment to people who might feel out of place. And so, yes, as I have been looking into materials and selection of colors specifically, that did come into play. My color selections actually come very much from that awareness. Colors are interpreted very differently across languages, across cultures. And so I was very aware of choosing colors that were not necessarily that were welcoming across the various groups that I was looking at. So welcoming to the North African perspective, to a Middle Eastern perspective, which are the two primary places that asylum seekers are coming from, rather than just being like colors that a Western audience would find compelling and welcoming.
So Zoe Hurt asks, as you described the two predominant types of depictions of refugees and asylum seekers, I remembered I've increasingly seen these groups depicted via, quote, inspiration porn, unquote. That is this objectifying, overly sentimental yet uplifting view of those who have experienced hardships. How can we work to not objectify artists via our consumption of their art, particularly in the space you have created? Fantastic presentation, Emily.
Thank you, Zoe. That's a great question. I think that it's always going to be a challenge and kind of a fine line. I looked at a lot of war photography in my research, and the way that photographers were bringing awareness to the experience of displaced people, people displaced by war specifically, and then viewing those from the perspective of how much is this showing a reality, and how much is this coloring my perception of this group and what this group needs and what their experience is. Um, so I think that's something that just having an awareness of the way that the media is presenting various groups to us, and how that may or may not be reflective of individual experiences is one way of doing that. Always approaching for individuals specifically who have the opportunity, with specific artists and their art, always approaching it with a curiosity and perhaps the perspective that you really don't know anything about their experience or their artwork. So you can, as much as possible, bring an open mindedness for learning about the individual experience, even if you think you know about the collective experience.
Thanks so much. And Alyssa and Paul wants to thank you so much and said that they really enjoyed this. And I want to thank you as well for, we never know on paper exactly what these presentations will be, but I'm always really so impressed and amazed by what students bring through their research, through their experience, and through the things they really care about and are passionate about. And Emily, you were no different this year. So thank you so much. So I'll give you
Yeah.
my own canned applause here. So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And thank you all of you who have attended. Next week we have our last event on the Gain Center calendar, which will be our Lafayette seminar. And the presenter will be Dr. Imani Perry, who's a professor at Princeton University, who again, with this idea of citizenship, is going to talk to us about her award-winning book, May We Forever Stand, which is a history of the Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, in the way it has traveled around and been used politically. I put in the chat box the link if you would like to go ahead and register for that event, and we hope you'll all join us then as well. But let us go ahead one more time and eat in our homes while we're sipping water and snacking on crackers before dinner time. Give a round of applause to Emily. And I can tell you from those of us, uh, your talk, for those who may have missed it, will be on the Gain Center YouTube channel. We have we have become very virtual, as many people this year. So for those of you who may have missed it or you want to share this with friends, please go to the Gain Center channel on YouTube, where you can also view all of the programming that we have done this year. And we hope you'll join us next week. Do you have any comments before we go, Emily?
Don't just thank you again. Thank you, and thank you, Chelsea, and everyone who organized this. I really appreciate being chosen and being able to share my research and my project with all of you.
Thank you, Emily, and we wish you the best. Thank you all for attending, and we hope we'll see you next week. I'm going to stay for just a few minutes for those of you who would like to click on the link to register for the event next week. But have a good evening. Well done, Emily.
Thank you.